Just to be clear, I had nothing to do with Germane coming here today. But I'm very happy and privileged and honored to be introducing him. Germane is someone I met a couple, 4 years ago now. And it was right after I was included in a list of people who were invited to be part of a new show at the Museum of Modern Art that became called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. And this is how small the Black architectural community is. I knew everyone on that list except for Germane. Germane is the only person I had not met before. I didn't know who he was. And little did I know, he was one of the biggest rising stars in our industry. I'll read a little bit here about his bio. Barnes is an award-winning research and design, Barnes' award-winning research and design practice investigates the connection between architecture and identity, examining architecture's social and political agency through historical research and design speculation. Mining architecture's social and political agency, he examines how the built environment influences Black domesticity. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, and received a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master of Architecture from Woodbury University. His thesis won the Thesis Prize for his project Symbiotic Territories, Architectural Investigations of Race, Identity, and Community. He's currently an associate professor and director of the Community Housing and Identity Lab called CHILL, appropriately called CHILL, at the University of Miami School of Architecture. He's also the director of the graduate program there currently. And the lab CHILL is a testing ground for the physical and theoretical investigations of architecture's social and political resiliency. His work has been featured all over, been published all over. If you've been spending any time checking out any architecture blogs, you must have seen his awards or his work. This includes places like SF MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, LACMA in LA, Chicago Architecture Biennial. He was one of the co-editors of this great issue of Mass Context. He's won awards from the Graham Foundation. He's been in the New York Times, Architect Magazine, Design Miami, Art Basel, Metropolis Museum, Domus Wallpaper, to name a few. He has a show. He had a quite amazing installation exhibit at the current Architecture Biennale in Venice. He's part of the inaugural group, the Dorchester Industries Experimental Design Lab. He won the Rome Prize. He's won the Wheelwright Prize. He was the Architectural League. He won the Architectural League Prize. This semester, he is not just running the NAB accreditation for his graduate program at University of Miami. He's also teaching, a visiting professor at the Knowlton School at OSU and at Harvard GSD. Alongside me, he was in the Reconstruction show at MoMA and is part of the Black Reconstruction Collective. And you will soon find out why I think he's one of the coolest people in architecture. And evidence of this is that his headshot has a pink fur coat. So without further ado, Germane Barnes.
Thank you, Sekou. And thank you for the invitation to come and chat. It's nice to see so many people in the seats. I got to convince my school to use this cheat code of having lectures during class time so that when we're up here, we feel like I feel like Drake. You guys got the whole presence, like standing room only. And then I heard there's a whole other building with more people that are also watching. It's like, it makes a person really feel special. So that said, I'm going to talk about a few projects today, probably like 5 or 6, but they're going to go fast. And ultimately, the entire theme is about the way that I've either experienced architecture or like to practice architecture because one of the things that I believe is that design education and architectural education prepares you for so many things beyond just designing a building. I think the way that we do our academic process can be applicable to the scale of a doorknob or to the scale of a large city. So a lot of stuff that you see goes across multiple scales. All right, so this is the title of the lecture. I heard you were looking for me. That's from a Jay-Z song from an album that you guys probably have never heard, but I do this thing where I try to put Easter eggs in my lectures and see if we can figure out where the line comes from. All right, so we'll keep going. So the first thing I want to talk about is my search for culture. And when I mean culture, I mean my own culture. We know the sort of statistics that exist within architecture that unfortunately excludes a lot of people of color. And so whenever I was studying architecture, I always found myself looking for people who look like me or work that look like me or culture that represented where I am from. So this is the city of Chicago, in my opinion, the best city in the whole world. And this is where I'm from. So that number one is the west side of Chicago. Oftentimes when you hear people talk about the city, they always talk about the south side this, south side that. I'm not from the south side of Chicago. I do not want to be from the south side of Chicago. I enjoy being from the west side of Chicago. And the tough thing though, is that's one of the more under-resourced portions of the city, but it's also adjacent to Oak Park, Illinois. If you've ever heard of Oak Park, it's because that's where people like Frank Lloyd Wright had his home studio and a bunch of amazingly beautiful houses. So imagine living at the intersection or literally the border of affluence and under-resourced communities because of where I lived. Now, I want to make sure I say this early in the presentation so that there are no misconceptions. While I grew up in this neighborhood, by no means did I grow up socioeconomically disadvantaged. Oftentimes, what people of color deal with is when you find some way to have some economic mobility, you still feel more comfortable around people who look like you because you don't want to be that one Black family or that one Latino family or that one Asian family in the neighborhood, people who don't look like you, because some of your cultural rituals may not be accepted by those who live in those areas. So even though I grew up in a very dangerous neighborhood, and it was, I grew up with, fortunately, both parents in the household. I grew up middle class. It's just whenever I walk outside of our bubble, I might have to fight for my Jordans that day. So it just depends, like might get into a fight, might not. But in my opinion, it helped shape the way I view the built environment. And so the number 2 and 3 is where I attended elementary school and high school. And so in understanding diaspora, I began to sort of research, like, where am I from? Where's my family from? So I received a grant from the Graham Foundation, also based in Chicago. And that grant was to look at the porch across 5 cities. And if you've ever heard of the Great Migration, it's one of the largest movements of African Americans in US history. And so many people who found their way into the North, their family originally was in the South. So for me, that meant my mother's side of the family is from Little Rock, Arkansas, and my father's side of the family is from Pickett, Mississippi. But they met in Chicago. And then February 14th happened. 9 months later, you got me. And so I think it's important to understand movement, because when we're talking about architecture, we have to understand that many times when we're fed different types of legacies or pedagogies, we're missing the second biggest continent in the entire world, which is insane to me because we know that the biggest export at one point in time were bodies from that same continent. So when I'm searching for culture, I'm always wondering why, after 6.5 years of architectural education, I never had a Black TA. I never had a Black critic. I never had a Black professor. But I know that this stuff exists because there's certain building processes and practices that were clearly adopted or moved or taken, but then I'm not learning when I'm going through school. And so I started looking at the porch, and the porch is something that comes from my family's background in the South. And if you go in Chicago, you see there's a huge porch culture. And one of the cool things about the porch is that it's both a library and it's a lemonade stand, and it's a space for therapy, and it's a space to watch cars go by. Like my favorite game is always "That's My Car," which is like when a really nice car goes by, like you or your sibling, the first one to say "That's my car," and if you call it, like it's theoretically your car, and like that's something that you do on a regular basis. Or when it's prom season. Any of you went to prom? You guys have prom down here, right? Well, for us, prom is a whole procession on stage. Like people are literally on their porches. Everybody has a front row seat. Everybody wants to see what you're going to wear, what kind of car you're going to drive or pull off in. It's a whole thing, but it's all facilitated by the community and the culture of the porch. And so in tracing it back, I ended up in West Africa through some research from John Vlock, who's this amazing researcher and anthropologist. And what you find is the linear cottage is all the way there, known as the TK, T-I-K-A-Y. From there, it found its way into Haiti as the Combet, K-O-M-B-E-T, and then into the southeast of the US, and then proliferated as what we know as the shotgun house. So in this search for my own culture, I actually was able to trace things back architecturally through this space all the way into West Africa. And you see some of these slides here. And so then I wanted to go around the country looking at various porches of various cities. Each of these have a very important connection to the Great Migration, Chicago being obvious, Washington, D.C., which is at one point in time called Chocolate City, is one of the few cities in the U.S. that had a Black mayor, a Black governor, Black senators, predominantly Black population. It is not that way now, but it was back then. And then obviously we know Detroit and Motown and the importance of Motown when it comes to the music scene in the continental US. And so a lot of my researchers took me around these cities, documenting various different forms of porches and activity on the porch. And so just a cool way of understanding how different cultures utilize the singular space, which we typically see as sort of an afterthought, like it's an appendage to the front of the building. It's not inside or outside, but it clearly defines area. And so from there, I kind of got this moniker as the porch guy. And one of the things you don't want when it comes to architecture, you don't want to be known as the person who does one thing, because then they pigeonhole you into that one thing forever, right? So if you all can do me a favor, when Sekou finishes his next book, he's no longer the hip hop guy, okay? Give him something else so that he can allow himself to have a different lane of research, a different lane of interest, because like you, we have more things we're interested in. And I'll be damned if I was going to do porches for the rest of my life. So I told these people, I was like, look, like I get it. The porch is why you heard about me. The porch is why you're interested in me, but I have so many more things I do that are way more clever. Well, for the moment show, they made me do porches. So this is like the last porch thing that I had to do. And so my project was called A Spectrum of Blackness. And Sekou, remember this list that they gave us, right? So they gave us these three things. They gave us a set of sites, text, and locations. Now you'll notice Miami is not on this list. And because I was always taught it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, I asked the curators if I can do Miami instead. And they're like, why would you want to do Miami? It's like, because Miami is a distinctly Black city. We just don't see it as a Black city because we see it as very multicultural. And so from there, I chose the spaces like the porch and the kitchen. And for spaces, things like ritual, things like care, things like beauty. And so in order to talk about Miami as a Black city, we got to go through some of the unfortunate histories that exist. So for many of you who will ever get a chance to visit Miami, one of the things that many people don't know is historically, Black people were not allowed to go to Miami Beach. Did not matter if you were as famous as Muhammad Ali. You could not stay in a hotel overnight on Miami Beach unless you had one of those racial identification cards. And the only people that got those cards were actually people in the service industry. So your maids, the people who took care of the tourism, things of that nature. And so I wanted to shed light on the fact that this is a city that only exists literally, and you can verify this if you don't believe me, it only exists because when there was time to ratify the city, they gave Black men the power to vote so that they can then pass as an actual city. And then once that was done, they revoked that privilege. So imagine building a city, helping it become what it is, being from water, because many of the communities that help build the place are from the Bahamas, they're from the Southeast US, which is wholly dependent upon water as a ritual and a space of care. and then to be told you cannot access the beach. You're legally not allowed. And so here's a map to give you an idea of what I mean. All those black spots are the area that the actual African-American and the African diaspora communities were allowed to live. Notice how none of that is actually on Miami Beach. Also, I hope you all know Miami Beach is not a real place. And when I say it's not a real place, it is completely man-made. It did not exist before Miami was created. It is built on top of a landfill. So just think about the fact that this place didn't even exist. And then they told people you can't access it. You're not allowed to go there. And then notice how far south some of these places are that the Black community was forced to live. Now, to make things even worse, many of you know climate change is real. Sea level rise is real. By a show of hands, who would believe me if I told you that the land that they made all these Black people live on are now the ones that are above sea level? Right? You actually believe me. Thank you, blue shirt. I appreciate you. It is true. And now we have this thing called climate gentrification, where those same communities are now trying to be taken back. Because if you live on the beach, give it about 20 years, you'll be completely underwater. So you tell people they can't live by water, you make them live inland. Just so happens because of climate change and emissions and things of that nature, now the land that they had is now under siege again. And so this was my way of telling the story of this area. And so as a part of the show, I made these 12 collages over here on the left, where I went in and I interviewed my team and I, many different diaspora communities, Haitians, Jamaicans, Dominicans, people from Puerto Rico, the US, and tried to find out what type of rituals of space they use in the kitchen, as well as on their front porch. And then many of you have drawn an exploded axon and rhino. We built one in real life. So that picture is an exploded wall detail of what I like to call the spice wall. Because if you go to many communities of color, they have like different types of salts. They have 12 different types of hot sauces. The spices are galore. But it's also a very quick entry point into understanding different diaspora communities, because you might eat the same thing, but have a different name, right? Like you might eat rice and peas, rice and beans, or arroz con dules. You might jollof rice, like all these things that exist, but they're all diasporic. And then we made these collages. So on the left is a collage that talks about that unfortunate history of Miami Beach, where people weren't allowed to be there unless you're in the service industry. And then on the right is the sort of ubiquitous photo of the young lady getting her hair done in her mom's kitchen while her mom's pulling her hair. And it's not the prettiest sight when it happens, but it's something that many people can resonate with. And then these are some pictures of the actual spices themselves. And each of the spice jars had little cheeky statements on them. So for example, in the African-American row for Louisiana hot sauce, it says, yes, hot sauce is a spice. Or for deviled eggs, for paprika, it says your eggs aren't deviled without this. So little things like that. So we finished that project and we went to Chicago, and literally 4 blocks away from our site was also Seku's site for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And ours was called Block Party. And so we had this open lot where there was a basketball court. And we wanted to see if we can make a play structure that's part Shumi Parc de la Valette and part ubiquitous pink bounce house that you see at block parties. And the thing about block parties in Chicago is, in my opinion, they're one of the best sort of egalitarian acts of collectivism, because you don't get permits for them. Everybody in the neighborhood just know, put the car at the end of the block. Everybody contributes food or snacks or supplies right before school begins, and all the kids in the community have what they need to start the school year. And so for an entire month and a half, every other week, I would fly home to Chicago and meet with high school kids. And we built literal blocks that will become the eventual block party objects. And so that is the final play sculpture that's there. And then that's right in front of the pink line. And if you look on the internet enough, you'll find pink's one of my favorite colors. So it kind of made sense that we pink line. And I also want to make a point that David Brown, who's this incredible researcher, he's the one that came up with the 2021 Available City theme. asked me if I wanted to do a project on the south side of Chicago, and you all know my answer was immediately hell no. Put me on the west side where I'm supposed to be and let me make something for my people. And then we threw a block party and everybody came out, and the food that we bought was local within 2-block radius. The tents that we purchased were 2-block radius. The DJ was 4 blocks away. Everything we did was 100% in that community, for that community. No money left outside of 5 blocks. And then we had a talk at the end where we did a launch for the book for Mass Context. And we had people there, and that actual barbershop where we hosted the talk was also 3 blocks away from the site. So our process is always about making sure we stay in the community to uplift the cultures that we work with. And then, you know, architects love to wear all black. So that's what you see in the picture. And then architects love to test the load for something. Oh, can it hold all of us? Can you think it can hold all of us? Now, if somebody had failed, it wouldn't have been my fault because they just kept climbing and adding more and more people. But this thing had a load of like over 1,000 pounds, so it's totally fine. And so we already looking for a search of culture. I also want to do a search for identity. And so this project was done for Lexus a couple years ago. This is the city of Miami. The top image is a neighborhood called Overtown. It was once called Colored Town for obvious reasons. And before that, it was called Good Bread Alley. So this is one of those these spaces within Miami that Black people were allowed to live. And then the highway obliterated the neighborhood. Because in most cases across the US, the people who don't have anyone advocating on their behalf, unfortunate things like this happens to them. And so Miami is no different. And so this is called the I-95, 195, 395 interchange. And it completely obliterated a thriving Black neighborhood into what it is now. And that's one of the few places that if you were someone like Muhammad Ali, you can live or stay in a hotel that's there or go to the historic Lyric Theater that fortunately that still exists, but many of the other places are no longer there. Separate from that, right down the street, there's an actual race wall. So it's called the Liberty City Race Wall. It's about 1/4 mile long. This is what it looks like. This used to be 12 feet tall. And on one side, it was a bunch of single family housing. And then on the other side, they built a bunch of low income housing because people who lived in Overtown, unfortunately, didn't have proper sewage. And so they didn't have quite good living standards. So they wanted to move them here. If you've ever seen the movie Moonlight, which won the Academy Award, that was filmed here. Like, this is a literal real place. And so when I think about cars, I always think about how cars fracture certain neighborhoods. And the wild thing is for those of you all the way down to your first year who are doing sections and everything, this is 4 feet higher than the left side. So even when it rains and when it floods, they're already at a lower sea level than the opposite side. So these are the type of things that were happening in the built environment in Miami. And so when Lexus asked me to do an installation about cars in Miami, I felt like it would be a bit disingenuous to like have a physical car there without talking about these same issues. So this is what we designed. A lot of you guys use wireframe when you're in Rhino. And again, like it's a real wireframe, 1-to-1 scale, new Lexus car that they're coming out with. And so the idea was to talk about sort of the ghost frame or the ghost communities that don't exist anymore in that spot. And then because every single brand wants something that Instagrammable, we gave them the swing in the background because everybody loves taking pictures in swings. Right, the thing lit up and it was like a queue that was around the hall waiting on people to get on the damn swing. But it was just a way of us talking about carbon neutrality, a lack of resources in certain areas, and doing it in a way that absolutely sort of sneakily has important conversation without hitting you over the head with the message. And then we designed some custom furniture because I mentioned to you all before, we work at multiple scales, and many of the architects that you're studying and learning about design everything from the chair in their houses all the way up to the house themselves. Like there's a reason why we sit in Eames chairs and we go to the Eames house in Los Angeles, right? But separate from that, I also do design buildings. It's because I have an architecture degree and they make me. So this is a project in Delray Beach, Florida, which is maybe an hour north of Miami. We're in the process of construction documents for this. We're at like 85% done. This thing will probably start pretty soon. This is downtown. Well, not downtown. This is called the Settlers District of Del Rey. How many of you have ever heard the term sundown town? Right? This used to be a sundown town here. Which if you don't know what it is, hold that question to the end. We'll have a conversation about it. But this area used to be a sundown town, and it was called the West Settlers District. But it's also one of the few areas that has a bunch of landowners who also happen to be of African descent. And for many neighborhoods like this, the biggest landowners are many times the owners of the local churches. Like the churches own so much land that they don't know what to do with it. And so there's this nonprofit called Thrive Del Rey that convinced these three churches, Community Primitive, St. Matthew's, and Ebenezer, to pool their resources together to then add some community assets and then share them. So this is the parish hall of St. Matthew's. This parish hall is used for everything from church repasses to baby showers to wedding receptions to community meetings. And we are going to turn this into a community workshop and a commercial kitchen. So this kitchen in the back will be open access so that people who are trying to incubate their own business can begin to create their own restaurants. And then we're going to cut back the southwest corner so we can make this sort of outdoor porch. And then we're going to give them we're going to push the front out and then add a bit more area to replace what we lost and then make that into a storefront. And so you can see a couple of diagrams of what the interior may resemble with some custom furniture that can be moved and reorganized as needed. And that is what it's going to look like. So you can see that's the part that we cut away of the building. That's the sort of outdoor porch. And then on the left-hand side, you see those fruit trees. We actually did a community workshop where we planted over 40 fruit trees, from mango trees to avocado trees, just so we can get some activity happening in the community as we're finishing up the construction documents here. One of the things that we learned is that people don't like when you give out free things. I know that sounds crazy to say out loud, but it's the truth. Because some of the feedback that we consistently received when we were coming up with the landscape plan was, what about the unhoused? What if they start taking things off the trees? We're like, isn't that kind of the point? Like, wouldn't we want that to happen? When we want to encourage, like, your churches, aren't you supposed to help the unhoused? So at least if we have these types of resources that's there, we can make things slightly better. And that's what the inside is going to look like. This terrazzo floor is already existing. It's already there. We're just going to repolish it and make it nice. The trusses inside are also already existing. We're just going to remove the ugly drop ceiling that's there and expose that. We do have to redo all of the mechanical equipment because it does not look that pretty. But a lot of these bare bones are already there, and we're just sort of augmenting them and bringing them up to code. Then at Ebenezer, because I mentioned there's three churches, at Ebenezer, they have this huge empty lot in front of their church, and there's a bunch of small businesses that come together at the Black Mers Market. And so we figured, what if we gave them a permanent market structure that they could begin to work out of? And the first thing we were told by the elderly people at the church is, but we still need our parking spaces. We don't want to walk. So that was our brief. Like, how can we make these kiosks that also adhere to standard parking regulations? And so we came up with this clever idea to sort of match the dimensions of the kiosk off an actual parking stall, so that we can have cars and kiosks there simultaneously. And then each of the actual kiosks will be docked under this much larger shade structure that can be used for community events. Because if you've ever been to Miami, you know it rains a lot. And so you don't want to be outside when that happens. And so this is it with all the cars out. And this is it with all of the kiosks that are actually out. Because we get tired of those really ugly white tents that you all see at every single farmer's market. We're like, why can't we actually design our own pieces that sort of talk about the identity of the people that are there? And so that's what it's going to look like. We're almost done with engineering on the big shade structure. And then these smaller little items are actually steel framed Bahamian kiosks that are 8x4. And then they're finished with wood accents, which reference some of the straw bale markets you find when you're in the Bahamas. And so this whole thing will be permanent, and then all of the kiosks themselves will dock underneath the larger structure as necessary. So the people who want to park their cars can still park their cars, but we can also have goods that are sold instead of using those generic white tents. And then when it comes to academia, I'm always trying to find ways to see what type of work influences me or how are we influenced when we learn about architecture. So if we're in search for influence, we'll talk about the project that is currently at the Venice Biennale, which is called Structuring Blackness in Rome, which all started as a part of my Rome Prize application. And how many of you take those history classes where they just give you like 300 buildings, you got to memorize them all, the survey courses, and the moment the class is done, you forget every single building that you watched. You're like, yeah, what's that building again? I promise you, when I took the exam, I got an A, but I don't remember any of that stuff now. But whenever we did those courses, I never got to see people who reflected the African diaspora. And then when it came to classical architecture, I never got to find out what type of influence did North Africa have on those people, because we know there was a reciprocal relationship between the two. And so this precedent really came out of me trying to find out what some of those influences were. And then because I like to bite off more than I can chew, which is evident by all of the responsibilities that Sekou told you I have, I was like, you know what if I design a columnar order which also reference that same history that I find that's missing? And so I'm always writing things, like almost everything I do, I start by writing, like, what is my process? What am I going to do to make this happen? So, I want to research, I want to become a mini expert, I want to do some mapping, I want to do some drawings. In the end, I want to attempt to make a brand new columnar order. And so these are the books that I started to go through. And one of the things that I found is when looking for these types of history, I actually had to leave the architecture department at the American Academy of Rome and go to the archaeology department. So archaeology and anthropology actually have way more information on North Africa and its contributions to Rome and Italy than the architecture department did. And through that, I found some pretty cool things like this, which is called Opus Africanum. Seems like a very generic wall, but it's not. If you see right along that center thread, you see a vertical stone, horizontal stone, vertical stone, horizontal stone. That is an engineering invention that was created in Tunisia, where people try to find a way to hold the wall together. And that allows you to actually have cross bracing within the wall so that nothing falls apart. But the other thing it does, it shows how much money you have, because the more horizontal pieces you have in between the large horizontal sort of stones shows you can pay for more labor. So the more tiny horizontal pieces, the more rich you were. And this is something that you then can find in Pompeii, which is not accurately attributed to North Africa. And then this is called Opus Sectile. So this is actually originated in Egypt. Looks like a standard mosaic. If you go to Palermo in Sicily, you'll see this all over the place. But the important thing is no two pieces are the same. So many of the mosaics that you see when you go through Italy, if you ever get the opportunity, they're always the same regimented little square that then makes something larger. Opus Sectile was something that allows you to take whatever the hell you have and make something that's either at a wall or at a floor that then you can find somewhere throughout Italy, which again, improperly attributed. And the reason we know these things are improperly attributed is because we use carbon dating. And with carbon dating, they found these things in Carthage and in Egypt before they found them carbon dated in Italy. And so when I finished doing that, I started to make this big map. And so this map is called That's Not the Right Size. And that's because the actual map that we all are used to, the one that uses the Mercator projection, is actually not the correct size. Many land masses are quite larger than they're supposed to be because of the word that we all hear all the time now, colonialism. And so through that word, we're able to see how people begin to show their dominance and power by re-augmenting the size of their countries. The funny thing is, two of the countries that often have it the worst, South America and Africa, are actually the closest to their actual size. So there's a gentleman who's way smarter than me. He's a cartographer. He literally did all of the math for every single landmass in the entire globe. And so I just took the data and then inputted it into Illustrator and scaled every single country by that value. And you can see how different the real size versus the size that we're used to really is. And then from there, tried to make this timeline, which then creates this story about where these items come from. So if you look at the top left, it starts at 1250 BC, and we can see things like Opus Africanum was used in Carthage before we find things other places. When was the Ionic order created, the Doric order? Victor I becomes the first African bishop of Rome, things that many people who are learning architecture never learned about, myself included. And then some of these things are actual objects and people and these are olives that were taken from North Africa and then imported into Italy that became a part of their legacy. And if you look hard enough and you put both of these edges of the timeline together, you actually get a transatlantic slave ship. And so from there, we made these drawings. And so these drawings are currently in Venice. And so this is me taking the column that you'll see in a second and then putting it inside of the Pantheon, sort of a way of talking about sort of futuristic legacies of people think the Pantheon came first, but actually this other column came first and they stole from it. Like, have you ever seen the Transformers movies where they have like Megatron and he's hidden inside of like the massive wall in Las Vegas and the Hoover Dam? And they're like, all this new technology you have is because we've been experimenting on Megatron for like 30 years. So this was like my version of that as a drawing. And then tangential to that, we also made these masks, and each of these masks relates to each of the columns. And so if we have Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian as the traditional triumvirate, I created my own columnar disorder of labor, migration, and identity. And that was based off of my time in Rome, the 7 months, going around, meeting different people from the diaspora. And so each column that's on the wall, far right is the identity column, the middle is the labor column, and the far left is the migration column. Each mask or artifact matches a history between that. So this mask here on the right conceals a portion of the face. The mask in the middle is something that's part KN95 COVID mask, because what communities were hit the hardest during COVID. But also, if you look up the historic auction box mask for enslaved people who were looked as chattel, they had to wear these masks as well. And in the far left are futuristic swim goggles, because unfortunately, migration for those people meant forced migration. And so that's the identity mask that you see there. And then when it comes to the actual column itself, the one that fabricated, we made the identity column. Columns are really expensive to make. I didn't know that when I was making them, but as a result, we only made one of the three. But I wanted to start from something that I knew. And so what you see here is a bunch of different cornrows, which is sort of the impetus for the first identity column. And so it started as this massive block of Spanish Marquina marble that was quarried in Spain, but this was fabricated in Wisconsin. And then you can see here on the right, is how we're going to start cutting out the cylinder so we can make it a bit lighter. And so you see the big cylinder on the left has been hollowed out. And you see through machinery, we've gotten the column down to this form here. And then through hand finishing, it became this massive 9 foot tall, 6,000 pound column inside of the Venice Biennale, where they had to pour an entire floor slab for me, or else the entire column would have collapsed the floor of Arsenale. And this was after we took out the entire 5 foot cylinder from the core. And so within that column itself, again, you already begin to see hair as a texture. You begin to see what feels like bodies bursting out. And then if you get really close to it, you'll be able to see that once it's finished by hand, it has the texture of wood as opposed to marble. And so I told the Biennale team I wanted people to be able to touch it. And they said, absolutely not, because if they think they can touch yours, they'll think they can touch everybody else's too. And we don't want other people to be pissed off at you. So I would just stand by it and say, absolutely, you can touch it. But then after standing there for like an hour, you get tired of standing. So you just kind of leave. And then they placed it right in between two larger columns inside of Venice. So you can sort of see my column, or my futuristic identity column of disorder, right next to two massive Doric columns that are also there inside of the space. And so the last project I'm going to show, and then we'll get to the Q&A session, is called Be Careful, I Always Am. We just finished this one in July. This is at the historic Emmett and Mamie Till House on the south side of Chicago. I know I told y'all I would never go to the South Side, but for things like this, I had to break my own rules. Because if you are someone who grew up in the States, you know the story of Emmett Till. So this is him on the left. This is his mom, Mamie, on the right. If you know the story of Emmett, unfortunately, he was a young boy who went to go visit his family in Mississippi. He was accused of catcalling a white woman. And the next thing you know is he was brutally tortured, murdered, and then his family had his body sent back. And his mother was brave enough to say, I'm going to open the casket and show people what was brutally done to my baby, as opposed to hiding this unfortunate history. And so this is sort of Chicago photographs from their collection at the time. This project was done in collaboration with Preservation Futures, who are two amazing, Elizabeth and Jonathan do amazing work as far as preserving typically undocumented historic spaces. So many people didn't even know that this house was their home. And through their advocacy, they've been trying to get the place on the historic registry. And so they asked us to do an installation outside of the house as a way of bringing up exposure to the house before they begin all the construction. And so some of the things that we thought was important was this iconic photo of him in the tie. Like everybody has seen, if you know this story, you've seen this picture of him with the tie. And then we found out he loved Superman. So like we thought it was awesome to like treat him as Superman. So we took the color palette of Superman plus the tie. And then we wanted to use the interviews with Mamie as a way of telling his story and being honest and truthful to the story, right? And the reason why the project was called Be Careful, I Always Am is because it's really about the call and response to a guardian in their ward, right? I used to say a mother and son, but that's insensitive to those who may not have a good relationship with their mother, or may not even have a mother at all. So instead, a guardian in their ward, where someone like me, I would leave the house, mom would say, be careful, and I'll say back, I always am, right? This sort of just arrogance that you know you're always going to make it home, which is unfortunately something that was not afforded to Emmett. And so we started with this idea of the tie at the far left, and we began to dismantle that, which is also representative of his body as it was mangled through the unfortunate things that happened to him while he was in Mississippi at the far right. And then we had this other iteration where we thought maybe things could dissolve. But one of the things we want to make sure is that that influence is not missed. That influence is not removed from our understanding of what it means to be Black within space or to be within these locations. And so we ultimately chose not to go with this version. We went with this version here. What you see far left, start straight, all the way to the right, which is mangled. You see the text on each of the banners. And then it's the color palette of Superman, his favorite comic book. And so you can see some of the things that are there, right? Like that whole idea was that he was supposed to be a child, treated as a child, and unfortunately never got the opportunity to grow up. And so this was the final installation on scaffold in front of the home. At the bottom, you see some hammocks, and those hammocks sort of act as exclamations to the bottom so that you yourself can be a part of their history as you sit or lay within this structure. And so this is a couple of my assistants that are sitting down within it as we're taking some of the photographs. And then ultimately we had a block party here too. We had an ice cream social, we had a block party. And so some of these people are people in the community, others are those that help steward the home, other those are people who know the story of Emmett Till, never got the opportunity to actually see the place and came to celebrate with us as we sort of talked about the history and legacy in the area, in the city. And so that's the last slide. Thank you. Oh, and one note before we start the Q&A. There are buildings that I could have showed you, but those lectures have already happened. And I wanted to give you all new content that's not on the internet. So if you do just want to see regular buildings, just Google an old lecture from like 2020 or 2021, and you can see all the buildings that you want to see.
All right, well, thank you so much, Germane. I'm going to bring the lights up a little bit. So if I remember how to do this. Okay, and then.
All right, and we'll
and
stop
then-
share.
Okay.
We're good.
And then I'm not sure, well, look at a picture of Mark, here, maybe.
That's a cool photo, though.
All right, so if you have questions, I am gonna come toward you with the microphone so that this gets captured on the recording and ask you to say your name, please, and if you want to say your year, and ask away. Okay, we got one in the middle. This is always. Let's see.
So, I'm Brianna.
Hi, Brianna.
I'm I'm a first year. I guess my question is like, code switching is a big thing, especially in like the professional realm and in architecture being predominantly white. So how do you still, convey professionalism but stay true to yourself and not have to worry about like missing opportunities and or like being ignored or things of that sort?
Did everybody hear Brianna's question? Anybody not hear the question? Because I can repeat it if you didn't hear it. Brianna essentially asked me, how do I deal with preserving my own identity within a bunch of spaces, which may not be the most kindest to that identity, right? So as opposed to just code switching. Unfortunately, I think we all code switch, right? The way that you talk with your friends is not the same way you're going to talk with your professor. Like I can guarantee you, if your Professor Blaine walked into the room, a lot of those curse words you all use by yourself, you would not use in his presence, right? It's just not the way that we operate. But I think when it comes to a space of safety, I do still protect my own safety. But when it comes to design, I feel like that's where I can just be myself. That's where the work should speak for itself. Emphasis on should. I think the cool thing is your generation has a much more open and accepting version of what architecture and design can be than the ones that we dealt with when we were younger, right? Like I never had a me on stage talking to me when I was sitting there. And you all have way more open instructors and administrators who want this type of content to be given to you so that you can be yourself far more than you probably thought you could. And so what I would say is protect yourself to a point where it doesn't get commodified. Like if you feel like your identity is now being packaged and sold, then you've probably gone too far. And so what I like to tell my friends is my entire work is, if you know, you know. So it's basically, I'm not going to explain like the nuances of it. That's stuff that we culturally get. And if you get it, awesome. If you don't get it, then it's not for you. But the rest of it is. And so there's a bunch of stuff I didn't say within the Block Party project. There's a bunch of stuff I didn't say within the Spice Rack that if you were there and you saw it, you'd absolutely get what it means. But that's not for me to tell. Those are the kind of things that you sort of safeguard and you safekeep so that you don't have to code switch. Also, I haven't been a first year in a very long time, but I saw the work you guys did. Y'all work look way better than when I was a first year. Way better.
Thank you.
Right. Oh, okay. Sorry. Thank you for the directions. Okay.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm also
Hey, Abby.
first year. A similar question was asked at the last lecture, so I'm curious. How do you deal with burnout, and what do you do to like take a step back and do a reset?
Fantastic question. Abby, I am not married and I don't have kids, so that makes things a lot easier. A lot easier. But burnout is real. For me, I play a lot of basketball, so basketball time is off limits to anybody. Like I don't answer emails, phone calls, anything on Mondays and Wednesdays from 5 until 7:30. And then on Saturday mornings from 9 until noon. Like that's my time. That's how I recharge. That's how I feel better. And if I'm not doing that, I might be like wishing One Piece was over because it just takes so long. Like it's like 25 years in and you still don't know what the hell the One Piece is. So I'm kind of very frustrated by that. But every Saturday I open Manga Plus and I read it because it is what it is. So these are the things that I do to protect myself. So when it comes to burnout, I think you have to find that hobby or that thing that you can remove yourself from architecture. Because if your entire existence is architecture, in my opinion, then you have, like, the only thing that will happen is burnout. Like, there has to be some other solace that you have besides that, that keeps you happy, keeps you charged up by doing this work. And so for me, when I finish playing basketball, sometimes I get my best ideas when I finish playing ball or when I'm watching a show or something like that. But that allows me to get back into it and not lose the love for it, because I'm one of those dorks that just want to be an architect since I was 5 years old. Like, I never want to do anything else. So luckily, burnout has not hit me. And the last thing I would say is start saying no to things. Because when you learn to say no to stuff, it also protects your ability to get things that you want to do done. Right? Don't feel entitled or don't feel like you have to say yes to everything, because you don't. You can absolutely say no. That is a real fact.
Hello, my name is Sedona, first year as well. Have you ever dealt with somebody saying, no, you cannot do this? And like, how did you deal with not them saying no to your idea of wanting to get this project done? And did you get to do it anyways?
Oh, absolutely. I have absolutely had that. I am from an era of architecture education where they broke your models or they ripped your drawings off the wall or said the words, "You shouldn't be an architect, quit." Right? So I'm from that era. You all have way nicer professors than we had when we were students. Sometimes I was like, man, if I was a student at that time, I would have been told, cut it or get out. Like that, like those were the options, right? And so absolutely was told that before. Some professor will tell you is their way of weeding out those who really are committed and those who are not. I just feel like it separates the lazy professors from the ones that want to do a job. One of the things I like to tell my students, and I've been an educator for over 10 years, is maybe I don't inspire you, because that's possible. So it's my job to help whatever skill set you have progress to the next semester. And that next semester might inspire you and you go on to do amazing things, but I can't hold that against you because you and I don't resonate, right? And I feel like the lazy professors let that influence the way that they teach. The ones that truly do care was that, you know what, you and I don't agree on things, but clearly you're talented, let's push the work forward. And that happened to me when I was doing my thesis project in my grad school. My thesis professor told me, you can't do race in architecture. Mind you, I never wanted to in the first place. I wanted to make a sneaker hip hop shop because it's the time I was listening to My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Kanye wasn't crazy yet. And it was like the greatest thing ever. And I was like, this is going to be an awesome project. And he made that comment. And then the rest of my semester, you know what? I'm just going to piss you off now because you said I couldn't do that. And through that process, I ended up doing a project that really was my own identity, and it won me the thesis prize. And so at the end, he was like, I apologize for my comment. And so some of it is you have to have the fortitude to do it, but understand when you want to be that student that pushes back against your professor, you can't be late to class. You can't be last in the review. You can't have a half-assed done model, because that professor's going to say, well, clearly I was right because you do the other stuff that came with it, right? So for me, I did twice as much as every other student, not because I felt like I had to, but because if I'm going to be a smart ass every day, I better prove the fact that I'm smart enough to do this. So this kind of thing, you have to get to balance that stuff out.
See. Yeah, right.
Hi, my name is Joseph. I'm a first year student. So for your Lexus project, did you experience any like censorship from the Lexus team? Did they ever like not want you to send the message you ended up sending because they were a car company, or did they expect you to kind of just like make their car and then advertise their product and then like leave? Or what exactly was their approach to the message you're trying to send?
Fantastic question, Joseph. Certain things I didn't show, but I get to talk about it. So look, they asked me to do the project. Well, I was shortlisted. So with projects like this, they have like 4 or 5 designers that they want to choose from. And then you put together a proposal, you send it. If you get selected, you get to do the project. I got selected 2021. The first proposal I sent was a purely hip hop proposal. It was like this huge artifact cabinet of curiosities thing. It was like the past and the future. And they're like, we hate it. It's like, awesome. The next project I sent back to them was this flora and fauna, because you're in South Florida. It made sense. The guy that made selection said, I hate flowers. It's like, awesome. So then the last one where I said, I'm gonna put a ghost frame of the car in the thing. And the guy said, wait a minute. So you're not gonna put the actual car in the space? I was like, no, it's like, it's an art gallery fair. Who wants to see Alexis there? Like, I don't get it. Like, shouldn't we have something else that's artistic? And so I showed him the renderings, and the guy said, okay, cool, you can do it. And so I did it. And I wanted to talk about the issues I talked about today. They were like, Germane, we have to watch the messaging. We want to be careful. And then they foolishly, Joseph gave me a microphone. And then when they gave me the microphone, I was like, cars are bad. Cars destroy Black neighborhoods. Cars, all that kind of stuff. And the guy was right next to me, and I was like, and here you go. And I'm not kidding. Like, this stuff is all recorded. It literally happened. They should have never gave me a microphone. So how do I deal with these types of things? Like, when you're working through it, you try to push the message as much as possible. And if they completely push back, then sometimes you have to just abandon those projects. I think for me, that one person that was pushing back in the beginning started to understand the importance of the project and sort of just let me do my thing. Because once we finished that project, they then took the car to Tokyo. And then when they finished there, they took it to Milan. And usually the person who got picked for Design Miami only did Design Miami, and that's it. So clearly they were fine with the messaging, because it's like, it's real stuff. Like, if you want to talk about cars, you'll talk about, unfortunately, the harm that comes with cars. And if I do a full 360, right, back to Sekou introducing me, the show at MoMA that pushed our show out when it could have been up for 4 more months uninterrupted was a show on cars. Literally a show on cars pushed out the first ever all-Black architecture show on MoMA's history. And there was nothing in the gallery for over 3 months. So it's kind of like, you can't really divorce the two. And as you'll see, give me microphones, and whatever happens, happens. My boy Diego in the front got his hand up too. So, he gave me a tour today. So at the very least, we got to make sure Diego gets a word in.
Okay.
He's a really good tour guide. You all should have Diego give your tours.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll pass it to you, and then you can pass it back a couple rows.
Hello. So my question is, how do you pick and choose which neighborhoods and areas you want to sort of represent? And does that area or neighborhood continue to sort of inspire work that you do in like other regions?
So the first project that I ever did, which I didn't show, but I was in the car with Carly and Lauren on the way from the airport. We were talking, from the hotel, we were talking about this project in Opelika, Florida that I did in 2013 and 2017. And so that project was the first ever neighborhood scale work that I've ever been commissioned to do. And so that one has like an art gallery, it has a farm, it has a park, it has an arts charter school, and I was the lead designer on all that stuff. So that was my first ever project, fresh out of school. I got very lucky to be the lead designer on a multi-million-dollar multi-site project, which doesn't happen very often. But that project itself showed me the power of working with neighborhoods. And so what I like to call it is a horizontal decision-making process. Because when you work with these neighborhoods, rarely do they know architectural jargon, rarely do they know anything about urban planning, but they have spatial knowledge, right? They know what it means to be within space of going to locations. And so I would lean on their expertise and their neighborhoods where they're from and use my design talents to then translate their needs, which is not saviorism. I don't go into neighborhoods saying I'm gonna solve all your problems. I'm 37 years old. I barely know how to solve my own problems. So I can't solve another community's. But what I can do is use over a decade of architectural skills to then help the things that they already know they need. And some of that comes with a bit of humbling and removing the ego, because the first project that we did, I wanted to design a couple buildings, and they said to me, we just want a park. I was like, but a park is so boring. I could do this other stuff. They're like, but that's what we want. And so I used those skills to do a park, and then from there it became all the other things. So typically a neighborhood or someone like the Emmett Till House will send me an email or something, say, we have this project. Are you interested? Will you work with us? And so that's the way we do this stuff. And so if people are willing to have honest conversations and honest feedback, then those are the kind of communities that I want to work with.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm Maddie. I'm a second-year student, and I love the topic that you touched on about multi-scalar projects and how we can design anything from a doorknob to a city. It sounds like you also deal with multi-scalar audiences. And I was wondering if you could expand on that topic and kind of talk about how you discern who a certain project is designed for and like what range and how broad you want it to be.
Fantastic question. Also, how many second years are here? You like the first, second year? Oh, okay, you got a nice little representation. I thought this was like all first year students who are like running the place. So for a lot of the projects that we do and how we commission, we try to have conversations around accessibility, but not accessibility in the sense of differently abled people, accessibility in the sense of who actually understands the work that we're doing. Like, do you need a degree to understand the work? And I find that if you do, I've done a very poor job, right? Because like my parents aren't architects, my grandparents aren't architects, my friends back home aren't architects. So if I can't enjoy the work with them, but only people who have a degree, then I'm sort of short-sighting all of the work. And so I think the MoMA project was the first one that I just said, you know what, I'm doing this for people who typically don't come to MoMA. And so we did this project, and I remember, you remember the first day, there was a bunch of people who had never been in the museum before. They were in there because we heard it was an all-Black show and we're Black and we wanted to show up. And so the work had to resonate with them in that regard. And so the coolest thing that I found about that show was I had a collage in there where I found this picture of multicultural and multi-ethnicities. And the young lady saw herself literally in that photograph where I got the collage from. She's like, that's me. I'm in MoMA. She took a picture and a selfie and it went viral for a little bit. I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And so for me, when it comes to the skills of people I've worked with, it's always trying to understand their ambitions first, because some people are very private and some people don't want the work to be everybody. Some wanted to be very open. Like the In the Chill project, they wanted that to be a big thing, a big celebration to get the story out. So that's why we did it that way. But then the Delray Beach project, that's just for their community. So they're the ones that go, and those are the audiences that we deal with. And so it's really about listening. A lot of this is about listening and being able to discern what's a project that's worth the time, which one is not. We don't want to go over capacity. And I never want to be a firm that's really big where we sort of lose that on the ground, tangible feeling that we have when we're able to have one-on-one conversations too. It's usually how we deal with it.
Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Andrew and I'm a first year, and I just
Another one.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your design process. You said you usually start by writing things down, but then what do the next steps after that look like?
Cool. So with every project, we start by writing. So when your professors tell you to write, it's not a bad thing. Like you really should, even if it's just blurb. So I'll start with a Word document and just whatever comes to my mind. It might be 3 sentences, a paragraph, 2 sentences. In the end, I sort of fish through that and see what might have a really good idea. Then from there, I still sketch because again, I grew up in an era where we had to draw stuff first. So I draw. And then once I finish drawing, then I jump into Rhino. And then we print everything at real scale, because the worst thing you can do is think something's the same size in the computer. And when you bring it out, you go, oh my God, this is gross, which happens sometimes. When we tell you to print things, you really should print it. Like, that's why we're telling you to do it. Like every single thing you've seen that we showed, we did prototype mock-ups in the studio of every single thing. And then after that, we refine and we go back and forth. And then that's the final thing that we put out into the world. So that's our process, but it always starts by writing. I don't know how to do anything without trying to tell a story and trying to use architecture or design to tell that story.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a first year student.
Nice to meet you, Charlie.
So I wanted to ask, you had mentioned about in one of your community projects how there were concerns about how the homeless would react.
Yep.
And your statement back was, well, isn't that the point? Aren't we trying to help them?
Yep.
So I kind of wanted to know some of your thoughts on hostile architecture and the way that it like impacts our perception of homelessness.
I think I'm still young enough to believe that there's inherent good in people, and that inherent good means that people start with good intentions, and sometimes those good intentions get corrupted. So like, I get the idea that someone's like, hey man, this is my house, and this like someone's making me feel unsafe because they're on my house, whatever, something like that, right? But then I feel like that's when you have a conversation. Like that's when you talk to someone as opposed to immediately, you know what, maybe I should put spikes here instead. Or let me bifurcate this bench so the person can't lay across it anymore. And so for me, like, I do not like septet. I do not like these ideas of Let's make sure we design to hurt, design to harm, design to keep out. Like, I feel like this is something that we can have more conversations around. But I think until we begin to have the real conversations around the social programs need to be attached to architecture, it all becomes a moot point, right? Like, a building itself can't save anybody. We have enough empty housing units to where we can put every single unhoused person in there. But then how do we deal with those that might be escaping domestic violence? What do we do about those that might have substance abuse issues? And if you don't have those other things to buoy the buildings and the rooms and et cetera, we don't really solve anything. And I know for us with this project with the churches, we were like, hey, you guys say you're a church, you say you're helping people. Why would we not want the unhoused to get free food from a tree that is literally supposed to feed people? And when you put it in those terms, they kind of stopped talking. They were like, all right, fine, we'll let you do the tree planting thing. And so sometimes it's combating that way. Other times you understand, maybe this is not a community I want to work with, right? That's the other alternative. Like, you don't have to do the project. When they were cool with us putting the trees, we were like, all right, we're good, we'll keep moving forward. But we could have said no. You all ask good questions, by the way. You ask really good questions. Oh, I dig it. We vibing. Let's go.
I'm Cora. I'm also a first-year student.
Y'all are like a cult.
In your Be Careful I Always Am project,
Mhm.
I personally like knew the story before you even like started it.
Mhm.
I was just wondering about like why you chose to hang your like final product on like scaffolding, which is something that's kind of like it can be taken down in a sense
Yep.
instead of something more permanent.
So, not sure if you all heard the question, but the question was, I got you. So the question was, why do the installation for Be Careful, I Always Am on a temporary structure like scaffold instead of something that's permanent, right? So because I showed you guys so many projects, I can give you all the details, but the reason we did it on the scaffold, because the actual building itself is under construction. And so if we had done something to the building, then that in and of itself would have made it temporary and never be used again. So by us putting it on the scaffold, when we take the scaffold down, they can still keep the banners, and the banners can be a part of the actual structure itself. And so they were fortunate enough to get a grant from the local union of bricklayers. And so they're literally reshoring the entire outside of the red clay. And so they're using the scaffold that we purchased for that to also help for the building. So the scaffold both helps them renovate their building, show the work of what's coming, and then when that scaffold comes down, they get to keep all the banners. Good question, though.
My name is Olivia. I'm also a first year. But you talk a lot about what inspires you, but do you have any like people who inspire you?
Absolutely.
And who are they?
Okay, absolutely. So I'll give you both personal and I'll give you professional. Right, we'll do professional first. So there's people like Chakwase Dyson, Olalekan Jafos, Amanda Williams, your professor that's here, Sekou Cook. He and I have had numerous conversations around hip hop architecture and stuff. I have friends like DeMar Matthews who are on the West Coast. Some of my mentors like Jennifer Bonner and Barbara Bester. These are all people that definitely inspire me when it comes to work, because I think they all work in a very free manner and one that's really rooted in always pushing boundaries and not just being stuck in the typical means of architecture, which I think we can all expand beyond. Personal life, I'm extremely inspired by my family. That's because none of them are architects, but like all the work that I do, you see them within the work. And so we have jokes about different projects that are literally inspired by them. And I think the best part is my mom never wanted me to be an architect, ever. Like, she wanted me to be a lawyer. And so she had me doing all this stuff to be a lawyer, which is why I'm pretty good at speaking and stuff. And then my dad, like in most dad fashions, is like, hey man, your mom said you got to do it, you got to do it. And so he's the one that's just dropping me off at places where I don't want to be. And then for the longest time, he never really knew what I did until like 2021. And he's like, hey man, for a while I thought you were gonna be broke and just like not know what's going on. I'm very proud of what you're doing. I'm like, thanks, Dad. Like, much appreciated. Meanwhile, my mom already knew. She already knew what was going on. He's in his own little world. But those are the people that actually inspire me when I'm doing this type of work. And the younger version of myself also inspires me. That's where I get most of these crazy ideas from. It's like, what would 12-year-old Germane want to do? And can I make that into an actual building, into an actual installation or something? That's where it always starts from.
Just gonna put it out there, another first year. So, yeah, but my name is Nipami, and my question is, as such a prominent person of color in the design and architecture industry right now, what's something that you hope to see for future Black upcoming designers and architects and people of color in this industry that you don't necessarily see right now or you want to see advanced?
Oh, I got two answers for you. Right. So the first one I'll keep specific to what you just said. The other one I'll make a bit more broad. So the first one, I would love to see more mediocrity. I know that sounds crazy when I say it out loud, but it's the truth. Oftentimes, if you're a person of color in the design field, you have to either go to Harvard or Princeton or Yale. You have to have like 40 buildings on your name. You have to be exceptional. You can't just be mediocre. I would love to be mediocre. Like, if you can be mediocre, then that means you've made it, right? If we don't have this massive benchmark, you have to fulfill all these requirements. Like, that's insane to me. So that's what I would absolutely love. I would love for us to be able to be mediocre, because that means everything's even across the board. Now, the second thing, and this goes to everybody, not just people of color, is if you struggle with survivor's guilt, you got to let that stuff go. Now, some of you might not know what the hell I'm talking about. Like, oftentimes we hear imposter syndrome. We rarely hear about survivor's guilt. A lot of you are from the South. One of the things you learn about the South is it's hard as hell to get out of wherever you came from. And many times your family might be from a very small town. My mom's town is, I say Little Rock because if I said Duval's Bluff, you gotta look at me like I was crazy. But Duval's Bluff has like 2,000 people. Like, that's it. When you leave Duval's Bluff High School, you stay in Duval's Bluff. And so what does it mean to leave a place? Or what does it mean to, dream or have ambitions and not feel guilty about it because your family might think, we need you to work. We need you to be here. We need you to do this other kind of stuff that sacrifices your own future. That's not just an issue for people of color. It's more of an issue for people of color, but it's often an issue of socioeconomic situations where your family might not have the means to send you off to school because they're working 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And so I always try to tell my students at a certain point, you have to get rid of the survivor's guilt, because that's how you break a lot of these generational traumas that happen over and over and over again. And if you're a person from rural Alabama or rural Charlotte or rural North Carolina, you know exactly what the hell I'm talking about. And so I think that's something that transcends your ethnic background. That's something that really comes down to the core of who we are as people. If you can get past that, then you will absolutely be successful in this field. This our last one?
This
Make
is
it a
the
good one.
last one. Okay. It's
Make it a
on
good one,
you.
Greg Polo. All eyes are on you.
So hello, my name is Daniel. I'm a
Hi,
first
Daniel.
year too. So last one, but first year. My question is how you deal with those moments when you don't feel connected with a project or a community and you don't find a way to like design something.
So, okay. So I think there's 2 conversations happening here, right? Because a lot of you all in your first year, you're basically talking about when you're in studio, how you do a project that you don't like. So when you're in the studio, right, some of the stuff you have to understand is just skill building. It's skill building. Like, you have to know how to design egress or a door or a stair properly so that people don't hurt themselves. Because Daniel, if somebody hurts themselves in your building, you're gonna get sued, bro. And you don't want to get sued. So some of the things that you're learning, you might think, oh, this isn't important to me now. But then what happens, and this always happens, is 10 years from now, you look back and you're like, man, that project Sekou had me do, it's applicable now because you're in it. And it's hard for you to see everything else that's around it. And so in these moments, absorb as much as you can so that later on, you can easily know I'm not interested in that project, or I am interested in this one. So think of these years as your ability to get as many tools in your tool chest as possible. You don't always want to use a hammer. You want to know how to use a screwdriver, how to use a wrench, how to use tape measure. If you only know a hammer, everything's a nail. right? So utilize this time to learn that stuff. And then once you get out of this place and you start doing your own stuff and you're working with someone else and running your own practice, then you'll know, I never want to do projects that deal with hammers again. But at least you know that because you've learned it already. So allow yourself the capacity to learn these things before you start pushing stuff away, because I'm telling you, it always happens. You get older and you look back and you're like, man, those projects from my first year sucked. But right now, you fight your professor every day saying, this is the greatest thing ever. Don't you love this? Then in your third year, man, those first and second year projects sucked. And that's a part of the progress, man. I guarantee you, you're going to look back and be like, I was really not good at this yet. When you get later, you are good at it, and that's a part of the journey. Like, please have fun through the process. If you're trying to get to the end, I promise you, you're going to miss so much stuff that is way more helpful. That answer your question? Cool. Y'all were an amazing, amazing audience. And you first year students, I swear, if y'all aren't like the presidents of the world by the time this place is over, I don't know what has happened. Thank you again.